it's a very, very, very difficult question to answer. But I think it's probably easier to almost answer what it isn't. In other words, divination is not using symbolism to prophesy the future. Divination is not limited to specific systems like the tarot or the bones or whatever it is. It's vaster than that. It's a way of being. It's a way of perceiving. It's a way of having a multi-dimensional sense of awareness of what's going on. So if we look at it, we've spoken about it in terms of a hunter-gatherer view of things. So if you think of, to go back to that image of what a hunter-gatherer, a small hunter-gatherer community in the midst of their territory, what we might understand is that, and this is a kind of an idealized scenario, because let's imagine that hunter-gatherer group had been in that territory for the last 20,000 years. Then you can imagine the ingrainedness of that territory. And of course, a territory would only be as big as an individual or individuals could walk in the space of a period of time. So, if I think of the territory of the hunter-gatherers that I grew up among in Western Botswana, the extent of their territory from north to south would have probably been about 6 weeks walk. The extent of their territory from east to west would probably have been about 8 weeks walk, something like that. So that's their territory, and that's been their territory ever since anybody can remember. And they're constantly in that territory, and they're constantly moving within it, and they're hunting with it, and they're within it, and they're gathering within it, and they're living within it, and they're interacting within it. Everything happens in that territory. So you can imagine how deeply that territory is embedded in them, and how deeply that their relationship with that place is embedded in them. In a way, what divination seeks to emulate is that, in its broadest sense. It's about a sense of knowing, because you have such a deep relationship with. So I don't know if this would work as an analogy, but let me try it anyway. If two people are getting to know each other, there's what happens over the time of that relationship is that the knowingness between them of each other and of self in relation to each other deepens over time. So two people who've been friends for 60 years, for example, will say, "Oh wow, I know exactly what that person's going to say. I know." So it's not necessarily a preempting so much as it's a deep sense of relatedness, which brings about a sense of knowing. And in terms of a tracking territory, in terms of a territory, then, and this is going to start taking me into what I kind of wanted to talk about with the bones. And I'm going to have to see how I do it, because I was going to transfer to my laptop to do this. But anyway, I'll see if I can do it with this computer. The way in which the tracking, the way in which that knowing, then in a sense is a microcosmic expression for everything from the everydayness of life right the way through to the most existential notions of our existence. So it's a kind of the territory gets mapped in the psyche. It gets mapped at a symbolic level. It gets mapped at a phenomenological level. So there's a sense of the phenomenology of our relationship with the place has an internal expression within us. And all of this feeds into a sense of knowing. So the fundamental adage here in Southern Africa is the diviner is one who knows. That doesn't mean the diviner is one who specifically has knowledge in the gnosis sense that we understand it in Western culture. It's just that the diviner knows, because they're tapped into everything simultaneously. And that's I think that was probably an innate way in which we were tapped into things right from the beginning. You know, when we were small communities of 80 to 100 people wandering around in a particular and very specific territory, we would have had this deep immersedness in the place. And within that, our relatedness to each other, to the creatures that inhabit that space with us, to the terrain itself, to the stars above us, to the space, to the times of year, to the winds, to everything, would have been so fundamental that there's a sense of knowing that goes with it. And so when there are also changes in it, the diviner is aware of those changes. So an example of that might be, you know, when I was in the Amazon, in the Amazon basin, and we were doing some work with people there. We were doing we'd taken some people from Southern Africa to meet people in the Amazon, and we were kind of cross-pollinating and talking about it. And they're sort of semi-hunter-gatherer. But one thing that is true is, although they're not exactly hunter-gatherers, they do hunt and they do gather, and they do have very specific territory, and they do have that same deeply immersed relationship with their territory. And of course, among the people we were particularly interested in talking to were the people who called themselves the shamans of the place. And we asked, you know, so who is a shaman? Why do you call yourself a shaman? What does it mean to be a shaman? And what they said was, well, we are the keepers of balance, and there needs to be a balance between all things. And our task when things go out of balance is to perceive where they're out of balance, and then to perform rituals and practices that mitigate that imbalance. Otherwise, sickness occurs. So sickness occurs in a state of imbalance. So a very simple expression of that would be, you know, when sickness breaks out in a village, in a little community, and the communities are between 80 and 120 people in that particular region, then the task of the shaman is to go into their internal tracking space. So they've got meditative practices, and some of them use psychotropic plants to help them, others don't. But they've got their ways of going into the so-called dreaming space and then doing their tracking. So they then go out into their territory in dream form. And they will go to different parts of the territory in search of the potential place where imbalance might be showing itself. So they'll be aware of where the imbalances in the individual or individuals' bodies, you know, if it's a breathing thing, or if it's if it's some sort of a, well, depending on whatever the particular condition in the body is, they're going to go and look. They're going to go and track that condition in the territory. So they go out into the territory, and you know, they might go to a particular river, and they think, okay, this is a particular time of year, and there's certain fish that are supposed to be here, and they're supposed to be swimming in this particular way, and they find they're not there. And they realize something is out, because the fish are supposed to be there, because they know they're supposed to be there, because they have that intimate knowledge of the territory. And as they continue tracking, they find that there's supposed to be a certain wind blowing at this time of year, but actually that isn't happening as well. And they kind of track down this road of so-called imbalance. And then as they do, they have practices for remedying that. So which is kind of the next level of divination. The next level of divination is the seeking of remedy, or the bringing about of remedy. So they have songs which restore balance in a particular way. They have different songs. And that's true of Southern African traditions as well. Among San people, they have songs. Songs and dances are among their most, I suppose, common forms of ritual. I mean, they have different forms, but these songs and these dances and these performances that they do are designed essentially to re-establish the balance. For example, to call the fish back to the place they're supposed to be at that particular time of year, or to call the wind to start blowing again in the way it's supposed to, or to identify where there's been some transgression on the part of people, because part of the task of monitoring this balance is to see how the balance between human and nature is being affected. So, and then particularly when sickness or difficulty in the community emerges, that's one of the first ports of call. And they might go out and they find, oh no, actually too many trees were cut down in this particular place. They find that as they move on their tracking path, they go and they find there's a particular area which has a particular kind of feeling, which represents wounding, which represents imbalance. And they'll go back into the community and they'll say, so we found where there's an imbalance. We've been cutting too many trees down in this particular place, or we've been fishing too much there, or we hunted an animal in this particular place and we hadn't done the preliminary rituals to establish that that animal wanted or was okay with being hunted. And so restorative ritual would have to then take place. And the restorative ritual would usually mean some form of balancing sacrifice on the part of humanity. What would they do to restore the balance? They'd have to give something up. They might fast. They might spend time in retreat. They might go back to the place where the trees were cut down and plant new trees. You know, there are all sorts of different ways in which this restorative process would happen. And what this would then do is it would ultimately, the hope would be restore balance. So that's essentially, when we're looking at this question of why divination, that's part of it. Divination tracks balance, and it looks for ways in which, and particularly if we go back long enough, you know, what we find, there's this age-old thing that we as human beings got separated from nature. And the old mythic stories tell us that the reason we got separated from nature essentially was because we stole fire. And it's interesting because this is an idea in just about all traditional story, mythic stories across the world, that somewhere or other we humans stole fire. And in the act of stealing fire, we unbalanced everything between the world of the human and the world of nature. And we've spent most of our most of our time as human beings ever since having to grapple with that imbalance and to try and consistently monitor and try and restore as much as we can the balance between human and nature. So that's a story that occurs in San hunter-gatherer traditions, in Siberian traditions, in Native American traditions, all over. And you'll find that there's a lot of work on the part of trackers, diviners, who are saying constantly, we need to make up for this deep separation that there is between humans and nature. And we need to be constantly performing restorative practices to do that, and to try and keep the equilibrium between human and nature as best we possibly can. So that's one of the purposes of divination in traditional form. And as we bring that into our kind of contemporary way of seeing things, we can begin to see how, of course, one of the great laments of our present time, as it has always been among humans, is we're separated from nature. We're this creature that stole fire, and we left our biome, says our current story, and we've been wandering the world ever since. And the cost of that is that we feel displaced. Even if we've been living in a place for 200,000 years, we still feel displaced. You know, that's there. It's inherent in the cosmology. And we're tasked consistently with trying to find a way of restoring that relationship. And no less, in fact, far more now, as we find ourselves in a really, really deeply schismed relationship with nature, I would say to you that the purpose of divination now, no less, and even more perhaps, is to help us restore that schism as best we can. Now, what do we mean by nature? Well, of course, we mean the natural world, but we also mean our own deep nature, our own sense of who we are at the very deepest primal level of who we are. And so we begin to map out the schism between what we call the provisional self, because in a sense, what these stories articulate is a kind of a provisionality to being human, which means in order to be human, we have to live in a separate way. because the nature of what we've evolved to become deems it that we are separate from nature. And so in that separateness, we're tasked with re-knitting ourselves back into place. And that happens within ourselves as well, because you could say, so, the provisional self kicks in from birth, in the sense we're born in our natural self. You could say we're born in the total territory of ourselves, if I could put it that way. And but very soon, of course, we find ourselves, as we grow cognitively, we find ourselves in a territory that is provisional, which says, if you want to belong to the human world, there are certain things you're going to have to do and certain things you're not going to be allowed to do. So we want you to smile, we want you to gurgle happily, we want you to be personable, we want you to be affectionate, we want you to laugh, and we want you to, all the things that we kind of condone. We do not want you to cry, we do not want you to wet yourself, we do not want you to kick and scream and shout, we do not want, so what happens then, of course, as we know in psychology, is there's this split, as Freud went to great lengths to point out to us, and the natural self is kind of gradually sinks beneath awareness to some extent, and this provisional self becomes our predominant way of relating to ourselves. So the provisional self says, well, to be human, to be civilized, to be acceptable, these are the things that, this is what it means to be a man, this is what it means to be a woman, this is what it means to be a mother, this is what it means to be a father, this is what it means to be morally part of the fabric of our humanity, this is what it means to be human. All of this is provisional. Which is great. Of course, it's important because that helps us navigate the business of being human and occupying our human territory. The difficulty is it's in a way more and more and more sequestered away, both from our own nature, our deep nature, and from nature itself. And there's a deep sense of displacement that emerges out of this. So one of the questions we find ourselves sitting with in these modern times as well, is not only how do we restore the connection with nature out there, but how do we begin to work with restoring our relationship with our own deep nature? What is our own deep nature? Do we even know? It appears in our dreams, it appears in archetypal form, it appears in our projected experience of things. But how can we become aware of that? How can we become, so when we're looking at this question of a tracking territory, in a way, we're going in with that question at the deepest natural level, at the deepest level of nature, who am I? And at the deepest level of nature, who is nature? And at the deepest level of nature, how am I separated from that? And within my practice, are there ways, as there have been since time immemorial among us humans, of restoring that schism? So, the extent to which we've become so-called modern human is a massive amplification of the schism between essentially natural self, with a big capital to N and S, natural self, and provisional self. And divination, the task of divination is to help us, first of all, understand that. Second of all, become aware of who is which, and then begin to find an intercommunicative relationship between these two parts of ourselves. So, of course, what I'm talking about here is kind of sounds deeply esoteric. It's a lot less esoteric than that, and we've been doing it for a very, very long time as human beings in every culture, and our stories, our myths, are filled with evidence of how we would have done it at one time. And of course, the old traditions, when we look back into indigenous cultures and those that still remain and the remnants of their traditions, we see how we've been managing and working with this process, and how we've been working with ultimately this deep relationship that somehow needs to be restored between being human and separate, and being nature and together. And so in the end, that's what divination seeks to try and do. So